All you need to know for this video is that when I'm using my method for evaluating quarterbacks, I look at the actual values for each stat, not them in relation to other players. But for this video, it's much cleaner to look at the rankings of players. So that's what we're going to do. And obviously, then you want to see lower numbers, except for on the far left, where higher numbers mean what they are actually getting in the numerical values of the stats. So it's a little bit confusing, I understand, but I think it'll make more sense as we go along. Also, if you have any confusion regarding any of the stats, I do have a video that breaks down EPA plus CPOE, that's expected points added plus completion percentage over expected. SR is simply success rate, which looks at how effective you are as a quarterback on a play by play basis. Meaning, if you get 5 yards on 1st and 10, that's pretty good. And if you get 5 yards, though, on 3rd and 15, not so much. PFF, I have a video that breaks that down. Quarterback rating is the good one, it's ESPN's version. Yards per game, I think that's pretty self explanatory. Net yards per attempt, one of the best stats that is definitely underrated as well, as it deducts sack yardage from your yards per attempt. So I think it's a much more versatile and inclusive stat than just regular yards per attempt. And lastly, ADOT is grayed out because it's not actually included in the metric, but it contextualizes things. ADOT is average depth of target, which looks at how far you're throwing the ball. So, with that said, there's 43 quarterbacks to evaluate. Let's get on with the video. I'm going to go through the analysis of each player's stats, but also I'm going to kind of look at them as a player holistically as well. So, for Deshaun Watson, he's dead last for quarterbacks. He's also sexually assaulted about 30 women. So, yeah, he's just, bad all around. Sure, PFF grade being 33rd is, that's really still bad. You're worse than every starting quarterback at that point. But it's not, glaringly bad. He's not throwing the ball deep. He's not doing challenging things. The offense is made to help him, and he still can't, thrive at all. Number 42 is Spencer Rattler, who is definitely not good by any stretch. Like, I'm not trying to say that, but there's at least some intriguing parts to him. Yards per game at 30th, that's somewhat promising because the ball was largely taken out of his hands because, one, he's not good, but two, he had Kamara as a running back, and the offense was kind of conservative. And the thing that really stands out to me, though, is 19th in average depth of target. He was, not throwing deep on every play, but he was getting you know, some deep threat to his game. And that's without Chris Olave, who's great, and Rashid Shaheed only played one game with Rattler as well. So, the number one deep threat, the number one wide receiver, both gone. And Rattler still, throwing deep at almost an average rate. That's kind of interesting. Definitely, again, not lighting the world on fire. He's the second worst quarterback in my evaluation. But at least there's, something there. Like, maybe he can be a good backup in the future with some refinement. He is 24, but, maybe he can develop quickly. Will Levis, his stats are better than Rattler, but Man, it's hard with Levis. He looks so bad when he plays most of the time. There'll be times where he, has a flashy play that's great. And I am intrigued by that 8th ranking for average depth of target. That shows he's slinging it. And, he does have a great arm and, can navigate the pocket a bit. So that's good to see. But basically everything else is just, not ideal. Cooper Rush, he is one of the least inspiring quarterbacks that's gotten serious snaps this year. Honestly, maybe the least. That isn't to say that he's the worst. It's just I don't see anything with him and think, wow, like he does that at a good level. He's just kind of going through the motions. He goes as the team leads him. And, he has better surrounding cast than Levis, Rattler, Watson even. Rush has a number one receiver in Lamb. An offensive line that I'm not saying is good, but is better than the lines for the players below him. So it's mainly on him that he's not doing well. Drew Lock, he is a bit confusing to me because he has a great arm and he was 35th in average depth of target. That just does not compute for me. I think, sure, you want to be maybe conservative. You got a backup quarterback in, but Brian Dable, your job's on the line. You want to maybe, open things up a little bit. So I think that's not all on Lock that he didn't succeed. I don't think he's good. I feel like I don't need to clarify. If we're talking in the 5th tier, you're probably not good. But with Lock, I think there's at least something there. He's got a strong arm and he's pretty athletic. I wouldn't say he's like the most athletic, but he's athletic enough. And he had Malik Neighbors, I would say, I guess would be the second best receiver in this. I would probably take Lamb over him, but honestly, Neighbors is really good. It's, I think, kind of competitive. So Locke did have some supporting cast factors working for him, but in large, I would say he didn't because the offensive line was pretty trash and just, outside of Neighbors, there's not much there. Next, we get to Anthony Richardson, who is still somehow like the most intriguing player in the league for me. I understand I shouldn't feel that way, but he was number one in average depth of target by roughly 2 full yards. That is bonkers. He was throwing just Hail Marys on every play. And, if not, he's running, which really disappointing as a runner. I thought he was going to be like this generational, like maybe the best runner of all time, honestly. Like, I'm a big Lamar guy, but Richardson's got Lamar's athletic abilities and he's like 20 pounds heavier. So I was thinking, yeah, Richardson could really be, interesting, but he has not panned out at all so far. He doesn't have the best supporting cast, but it's definitely the best in this tier because you got Josh Downs, who's solid, Alec Pierce, who's pretty good. They were a good pass blocking line, and yeah, like that, combines together for a pretty nice marriage of talent. Richardson, he did have a little bit of that redeeming quality with the net yards per attempt, showing he wasn't getting sacked very much relative to other players because being 22nd, you're still getting sacked a lot. This upcoming year is going to be massive for him. Like, if he doesn't show up and just click pretty much immediately, yeah, it's going to look pretty bleak. Next is Jacoby Brissett, who is a guy I've pounded the table for a while now. And he is not, rewarding me for that. He I think his stats look, just overarchingly worse than a lot of these players. But again, the actual ranking of these players is determined not by their statistical placement. And with that said, he doesn't give you anything to feel great about, but he also had next to nothing working in his favor. He had PFF's 31st ranked pass blocking offensive line. His only option to throw to was Hunter Henry, who was 22nd among tight ends in yards per route run. That's your best dude? Is a guy that's 22nd for tight ends? Not all players, tight ends, just alone. Yeah, that's not great. Next, we have a tier gap, and we go to tier 4, which is, I don't want to too tightly define any of these because it's largely just, speculative. But the 5 tier is not great backups playing. Tier 4, you get to guys that are, not going to win you any games, but they might not be tragic if they have to play an extended amount of time. And we start off with Gardner Minshew, who really shows his attributes in the fact that I love the marriage of success rate and ADOT for him. He does not have a good arm. I would say it's one of the 5 weakest in the league. And he is thereby not going to throw the ball deep as much. And also, he's going to have to be successful in the short game, of course. And he's showing that he can be successful because on a play-by-play basis, he might not be racking up those, long touchdowns, but he's going to get a 6-yard gain on 1st and 10, and then a 4-yard gain on 2nd and 4, and just keep the sticks moving. So Minshew is kind of exactly what his stats say he is, in my opinion. Mac Jones, he is another guy where I just don't feel super strongly about. I think that he might just be destined to be a solid backup quarterback and not an elite one, but a respectable one that can go out there and if you have a strong run game, he can hand the ball off pretty well and trust the defense and so on. Jones, there's just nothing great or awful about him, so I think that is alluring to some teams. I would rather have a more high variance quarterback, but that's an opinion based thing. I don't have metrics to back that's going to be more successful in the long term. Caleb Williams, I would say far and away the most talented quarterback of this tier, which might get me in some hot water with Cowboys fans. But Caleb is fast and he's got a great arm. He is, always looking to make a big play, which was not helpful when the receivers just were not separating. And he was getting, sacked a lot, which leads people to think that the offensive line is terrible. But in reality, PFF ranked it as the 9th best pass blocking offensive line in the league. He also had top 5, I want to say, average time to throw, which kind of does coincide with maybe the line was blocking well. He was just holding onto the ball super long. It's hard because it would seem like the line just is terrible because Fields and Williams have had trouble with it, but they're both quarterbacks that like to hold on to the ball. So that's kind of, I think the overarching issue with Aiden O'Connell. He is like Gardner Minshew, but just a little bit more athletic and a little bit better of an arm, I would say. That's why I think with Minshew, they're rather similar. Their statistical profile is also just very much overlapping. Most of the stats they're kind of just like one or two places off for, except for with quarterback rating. The average depth of target, I realize too, is a bit different with O'Connell, but like I said, he does have a little bit better of an arm than Minshew, and I think the team just was in a different place when O'Connell was playing versus when Minshew was. But you might know better. I didn't have my ear to the Raiders all that well. Andy Dalton, an analytics darling for the past several years, honestly. He is, I think, exactly as advertised as well, kind of in the Minshew realm of things. 40th in average depth of target, and he doesn't even have the redeeming quality of being good in success rate, as he's 35th in it. So he's, not really efficient, and he's not getting big chunk plays either. But he also has a detritus team around him that was lacking like any receiver talent. Adam Thielen was far and away their number one guy. Coker was like an intriguing player, but not like a very productive player. He was just better analytically. The offensive line actually wasn't too bad for Dalton, so he had that working in his favor. But overall, it's just like you got maybe the worst tight end situation in the league. You have, you know, limited receiving options. It's not a great thing. So I can see why Dalton slowed down a bit this year. Still 22nd in QBR though, better than, a lot of players. But with that said, we get to Dak Prescott, the alpha of this tier. I think if you're a Cowboys fan, you've probably already, tuned out. But Prescott, I'm not putting too much weight on this year. He played a very limited sample size with a team that was not set to, help him succeed. They were 23rd in pass blocking grade per PFF. Yes, Lamb is good. Turbin was pretty efficient. I don't know what his overall production was, but I know he was overall pretty solid in the like analytics realm, but I don't think he was putting up crazy numbers like for yards. Ferguson, I guess, is all right. Um, it's just, you know, Ferguson actually is not that great. He was 31st for tight ends and yards per route run. So, there's not a great line in front of him, and the receivers outside of Lamb, not very productive. Part of that is Cooper Rush was the quarterback, but overall, I think the team just was not very good around him. Next, we jump to tier 3, where, again, I don't have like the clearest definitions for these guys, but these are like roughly average, and like they definitely have a range from like below average to above average, which I think makes sense. There's this is tier 3 and there's 5 tiers in total, so it's kind of that midpoint. But with that said, we start with Daniel Jones, who's definitely like the below average side of things. He at least was keeping things on track for the offense. He was definitely taking a lot of sacks, which is not all his fault. The offensive line in New York is just horrendous. And he was, just kind of whatever. And the other stats, like he is, I think, the like higher end version of the backup kind of quarterbacks, like the Mac Jones. Daniel Jones is honestly probably less refined than Mac Jones. I hate that they're both Jones because I can't, use the last name. But Daniel Jones is, yeah, I think more reliant on, just speed and, you know, being a good athlete holistically. Mac Jones, I think, is actually like kind of a quarterback, but Daniel Jones was getting better results. So, I'm not going to knock him for, his process. It was kind of working. This one might get people riled up as well. CJ Stroud, he was just not as good as he was last year. Like, simply put, that EPA plus success rate combination is pretty rough. Even still, that PFF grade, 14, is really respectable. The offensive line for them, I guess it's not as bad as maybe we generally think. PFF ranked it as the 19th best, but overall, it's not a good line. And especially on the interior, there would be interior pressure a lot against Stroud. So that was, problematic. And he still was making plays. And the 13th average depth of target, I think, was a bad marriage with the poor offensive line because, you need more time for routes to develop, of course, and you're just not simply going to have that. Nico Collins was their only, sure thing at wide receiver. Tank Dell was also, but uh, Dell was not quite up to, Collins' level. Collins is maybe, top 2 in the league, top 3, I would say. And Diggs, he only played half the year. It's not like he was getting support that way. So there was a lot that worked against Stroud. I think it kind of makes sense that he had, as much of a struggle this year. I love seeing Bryce Young be in like the respectable tier because that year one, man, that was really rough. But here we go, year 2. This is a stat that's not included. He was 3rd in big time throw percentage according to PFF, which is just like really well placed ball in tight coverage, or like, a really deep pass that you had to like navigate the pocket for. So 3rd in the league, really impressive stuff. Young is PFF darling as well, just in general, being 22nd in that in QBR. Not too bad, especially when I think he was their worst quarterback last year. Maybe not, but he was definitely at the bottom. And, didn't put up yards, but he had an average depth of target in the, top 10. That's, pretty good. There was a lot of things he was doing that was impressive, especially given the reputation he built from year 1. Aaron Rodgers, man, weird off the field, weird on the field. He was so divisive. I love just looking at the middle stats where you have 15, 30, 13. That really sums it up. He was apparently good, according to the people at PFF that watched him. I don't really get that one. But, the yards per game, that's pretty set in stone. He was passing the amount of yards that people say he was. So that, though, is more of an attempts-based thing. He was getting, I believe, top 5 in attempts. So he was, you know, making some out of it. Like, he wasn't making the most out of it, that's for sure. But, he was producing a little bit. 35th in average depth of target. They had some capacity for deep threats. You have everybody's favorite Allen Lazard, of course. I'm just kidding. Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams. They both can win deep. Particularly Adams, really. And, they should have had that connection built in. It didn't really, though, early on. came on kind of towards the end, but who cares? Rodgers, I wouldn't I wouldn't take a flyer on him, not at his age and not with the production he's shown lately. Mason Rudolph. He is really efficient in the sense that he just continually does what he needs to move the sticks. That 13th success rate shows that. But, he's just not moving the ball all that well. He had that 29th average depth of target, 23rd in EPA plus CPOE. That's kind of based, it's not based entirely, but it's a good percentage of that stat is going to be just, how many yards can you rack up in limited amounts of plays. He wasn't really doing that. So that rank reflects that. And yeah, just everything else, like, looks like a good backup type of stat. For Jameis Winston, he is another sexual predator, at least according to allegations that were made in college. So the Browns definitely got a type. And Winston, you know, I wish he didn't have that allegation against him because he's a fun player to watch. Third in average depth of target, he was, big game hunting on a lot of plays. And, that's the main thing he had going for him. The other thing, too, is he was doing pretty good at not taking sacks, which is impressive because the Browns don't have a good offensive line, contrary to what, I think a decent amount of people would think. Because I think that people just blindly assume, like, your line is as good as it was 3 years ago. And, you know, things change, and the Browns are a good testament to that. They were not very good this year, but years past they've been elite. So that's all I got for Winston. With Russell Wilson, I'm a bit conflicted with him. I definitely would not want him to be my starter. Like, that's not up for debate. But I want to know, like, just how good he actually is, and Pittsburgh is not a good place to, define that. All they got is Pickens, and they got Freiermuth as well, but Freiermuth is a little bit overrated in my opinion. Freiermuth is 18th in yards per out run for tight ends. Keep in mind, there's 32 teams, 18 below average. So, part of that is Russ and Fields don't look at the tight end. I get that, but at the end of the day, if you're wide open, the quarterback's going to find you eventually. And they just were not finding Freiermuth, and I don't entirely blame them. Obviously, if you have the choice between Pickens and Freiermuth, I know who I'm thrown to. But I think if the offense had a better offensive line and had multiple threats to be deep threats, Calvin Austin, it seems like he can get one deep play a game, and that's it. Like, he checks out after that. So if they had, like, reliable threats, I think he could have had, like, maybe top 10, maybe 10 for average depth of target. I'm not saying he's going to be number one, but I do definitely think that deep ball is still there. He throws a pretty one. And really, the fact he was 21st in net yards per attempt, not the worst, because that offensive line really wasn't good. It was 24th in pass blocking per PFF. So, there are some things that worked in his favor. I think he has a fit for somewhere. It's just kind of hard to see. Drake May, honestly, I'm pretty pumped if I'm a Patriots fan with the year he produced. Yeah, he wasn't, you know, lighting the world on fire like Jaden Daniels was. You want to talk about a great rookie that we're going to get into him later, but May, he did a fair amount with what he was given. That success rate and QBR I like to see, 18. That's pretty good. PFF, I think doing him a little bit dirty by saying he was 28th because I think just, from what I saw, there was, and this is based on every stat imaginable as well, there was just not a lot to, support him with. And, like there'd be times where he'd just be running for his life as soon as he hiked the ball and then no one was open. It's like, what do you want him to do? Like, you're not going to get a positive play in that situation. The Patriots, again, had the second worst offensive line in the league. So they really, and then again, Hunter Henry was their main guy. It's pretty hard to do anything in that situation. So I think May showing any signs of life would be, reason to be a bit optimistic. Next, we have Justin Fields, the guy that I think resoundingly should be the Steelers quarterback. Not because I think he has some like hidden untapped potential, but because, you know, he has like, I think 50% chance of being pretty bad and a, like 10% chance of maybe being good. And, somewhere in between, of course, is taking up the rest of the percentage. But with him, you get, some upside at least. With Wilson, we know what Wilson is. I think that's fair to say. But with Fields, I'm not saying the Steelers are going to compete for anything this year, or this upcoming year, but, he gives you competitive quarterback play for cheap. And, again, if he sucks, that's great. You get a higher draft pick. Joe Flacco, man, what a guy. He is fifth in average depth of target, which I love to see. He's still got that cannon for an arm. No longer a cannon, but he's still probably got like an average or above average arm. I really struggled to evaluate arm talent in that sense, but I can read the stats pretty well. He's throwing deep pretty all right. And, I don't know what his turnover worthy play is percentages, but it's got to be like 50%. Like half of his passes are like a deep bomb, or the other half is an interception or a ball that should be intercepted. So it's a fun time with Flacco. I'll take him as a backup. Being the high variance option. Like if there's a game where you're going against the Chiefs, he's gonna try to outduel Mahomes, which probably like 80% chance gonna go terribly. But there's that like 10% chance he's actually gonna do it, and I'll take that over like Mac Jones again. Not to throw him under the bus, but he just comes to mind. I'll take that over Mac Jones, who's just the guaranteed. I'm just gonna hand the ball off, and that's all I can do type of quarterback. Flacco, he was efficient with moving the sticks, and he was getting some yards. Bo Nix, this one might get me some hate as well. Bo Nix was really solid at the end of the year, but the start of the year counts as well. And that was just not too, hope inducing. The end was, but I couldn't get behind what he was producing early on. And it's not like he has a bad supporting cast. Sean Payton, I think, still has a pretty good grasp of things. I know a lot of analytics people like Eric Eager had pretty good thoughts on him. And the offensive line was elite. It was PFF's number one pass blocking line in the league. So, that's pretty good. The Cortland Sutton, I'd say he's ideally probably a number two, but he can be a number one as well. Trevor Lawrence, I think people are unfairly criticizing him because I'm not going to act like he was good this year. Like I think he was kind of just whatever. But I think a lot of people are like, yeah, he's terrible. I don't think he's bad. Like I think in the grand scheme of things, he's an above average quarterback, which is definitely disappointing for the number one overall pick that was like promised to be the generational talent of, that draft when there'd be like three other generational quarterbacks behind him because every year is somehow a generational prospect. But anyways, Lawrence, he was, slinging it deep, second in ADOT, and, you know, 17, 18 for QBR and PFF grade. That's a pretty good, advanced analytics uh, placement there. Obviously, he did have the benefit of Brian Thomas Jr., who's awesome. And Christian Kirk is, I think, a reliable number two. Evan Ingram, I don't know how much all three of them played together, like just in general, but he had at least one of those guys basically at all times. And yeah, I think he was all right. And I think, if he gets in a better scheme with Liam Cohen, which I think is definitely possible, there's a chance he could be, one of those fringe top 10 guys. Kirk Cousins, he definitely sucked at the end. Not going to deny that. But man, look at the yards per game. Look at the net yards per attempt. Pretty good, right? 25th in QBR, it's kind of like what? But, I think you kind of need that 25th in there to balance them out because the end was really bad. It was like, I don't know, 5 or 6 games of being really bad. So, like, half the year, or his year at least. Either way, he, you know, he was something. Like, I still to this day cannot really make heads or tails of him because he just really was a completely different quarterback for half the year. And, the game against the Chiefs, he wasn't good, I want to say. And there was, I guess, pretty, big stretches of him not being good. But I think overall, it was an above average year. Again, we're considering all quarterbacks here. And, the stats definitely bear that out. So it's not, I guess, the craziest notion, but it's kind of against public opinion by a decent margin. Finally, we get to tier 2, which is where things start popping off as we get to like the real legit quarterbacks of the league. These are quarterbacks you can win playoff games with. And with Geno Smith, he was a very interesting combination of things because that sixth in yards per game, they were getting after it in the passing game pretty well, but he wasn't throwing deep, as evident by being 29th in average depth of target. So he was methodical, and PFF backs it up as well. He was doing well. That net yards per attempt, pretty impressive to me, as they had the 26th ranked PFF pass blocking O line. So being average with a very below average O line is pretty impressive. Then for Matt Stafford, we have a guy that kind of surprises me actually for being as good in the average depth of target realm as he is, because 22 is, not good, but I'm surprised that Geno and Stafford have the ones they do. In my head, it would have made more sense if they were opposite or reversed rather. So with that said, Stafford, very efficient on every, single down. And I think a lot of that, no offense to him, but I think a lot of that is, Puka Nacua was the most efficient receiver in yards per out run by like a lot. He was like, I want to say like a half a yard ahead of the next closest receiver. It was something crazy. Like he was at like 3.5 yards per route run, and I think it was AJ Brown was at like 3. So it was, you know, definitely beneficial to have Puka. But in Stafford's defense, I guess Puka only played 11 games. Cup played 12. So the offensive line as well, horrendous, 30th in PFF pass blocking grade, which again, props to Stafford. Net yards per attempt, 13. That's good. He was not, getting sacked very often, considering his offensive line was just horrendous. Derek Carr is our next guy. Carr is, in my opinion, this is so funny. I think he's the most underrated quarterback for this season, but this season alone, because a couple years ago, I heard everybody and their mom saying, "Oh, Derek Carr's the most underrated quarterback in the league. He's so underrated." It's like, well, if everybody's saying it, how is that the case? And then he followed it up with a stinker year, and then this year legitimately has one of his best years of his career. Like, I'm not gonna say it's better than the year he was in MVP contention, but he was really good this year. And the only thing that worked against him was he wasn't efficient in success rate, which I do think is something, because in meaningful games where you're going against good teams, you can't just throw bombs all day. It's definitely the cool thing to do, but you're gonna have to hit the intermediate and short parts of the field as well, just to keep the defense honest. So, he was showing maybe a lack of proficiency there, but look at these other stats. Like, the yard per game, I guess, could be better, but really, I I can live with that with the efficiency he was given. He was so let down by the offensive line situation, which I think was, you know, a chunk of it was injuries, but also just a chunk of it was not having proper talent. And, Carr, 32nd, ye dead worse, or absolute worse, dead last in PFF grade for pass blocking. And yet, Carr is 6th in net yards per attempt. He was not taking sacks like he should have been. That, I think, is just ridiculously impressive. And, I just realized too, PFF's given him praise as well with that 6th rank also. So, Carr, great stuff. Again, he's held back by the success rate stuff, which, I'm not going to act like I'm not going to say is nothing, but I think a lot of people are just like, oh, he's washed up, he's not good, he's whatever. Like, no, he had no receiving talent. Olave played 8 games, at least with Carr, I believe. And, Olave was good, but that was basically it. Like, I think he played with Shaheed as well, but I'm not entirely certain about that. I'm pretty sure. Either way, at best, he had 2 good wide receivers, let's say, and the worst line in the league. And he was still really producing. Next, we have Tua, who is always going to give you logical fans, of course, the ones that don't have any bias or strong opinions. As no one would ever say he's not an NFL caliber quarterback, and no one would ever say he's a top 5 quarterback. I'm joking, of course. Tagovailoa is, I think, divisive in his stats, like he is as the player, which isn't always the case. So Tua, 7 in EPA plus CPOE, that's really good. That success rate, awesome. Yards per game, great. Then you look and it's what's going against him? The only thing that goes against him is the PFF grade. And with that said, he also had the worst average depth of target in the league. So I guess, that's something as well, but that's again, like, that's the secondary metric. That's not a metric that I'm actually holding against him. It just contextualizes things. So yeah, Tua was definitely not throwing the ball deep at all, which is crazy when you have Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill. But and Jonnu Smith, like, he can get deep downfield. But anyways, it's wild how he was producing, but he was really producing when he played. I don't care what PFF says. Like, if everybody else is saying you're doing well, I think you're probably doing well. Maybe he wasn't doing as good as the numbers, like the other numbers showed, but he definitely wasn't the 28th best quarterback. I think that's for sure. Next, we have Sam Darnold, the perhaps biggest surprise in the league this year. I would say pretty confidently. Darnold was a little bit of everything. He threw deep a fair amount, actually a lot, being fifth in the league with that. He was racking up the yards, so it wasn't just, whatever production. And he was analytically sound as well. So, with the PFF and success rate being where it is. So, that's good to see. And I will say, Kevin O'Connell is the mastermind of the offense, but Darnold executed it, and the wide receivers and offensive line definitely helped as well. Justin Jefferson, top 5 receiver. Jordan Addison, I would say, like, top 10 number 2, and the offensive line is 15th in pass blocking. Jordan Love, he had an amazing supporting cast, as Matt LaFleur is one of the best coaches in the league. He had a top 3 pass blocking offensive line, and Christian Watson and Jaden Reed were both top 17 in yards per route run for wide receivers, and then Tucker Kraft was 11th for tight ends. Love wasn't just a bystander for the success of the team, though, because his amazing arm talent and just overall willingness to be aggressive with deep balls, as evident by him having the 5th average depth of target in the league, was a huge factor in the team's offense clicking. Love also was not taking sacks, which is, again, partly offensive line protection thing, partly the receivers getting open quickly, but it's also partly, him navigating the pocket well and getting rid of the ball pretty quickly. He didn't have the greatest overall production in yards, but he was very efficient, except for, again, kind of in like the short parts of the field where he would oftentimes, I think, get a little bit overly aggressive or just, be greedy in trying to throw deep as opposed to just taking like short yards. But overall, I think it's not the worst problem to have because, again, it was beneficial a lot of the times. Next, we have a controversial one with Jalen Hurts, the Super Bowl MVP. Hurts was. I'm not factoring in the playoffs, by the way. So that is one thing to remember. Hurts was elite as a rusher, and he was also effective in passing insofar as if the reads were simple, he was executing them at a very high level. It just was not always the greatest when things became murky, which, I think kind of makes sense at the end of the day. AJ Brown, great. Devonta Smith, great. Dallas Goedert, really good. The offensive line, incredible. So, they had some strong things in their favor, but they didn't have a third receiver for a lot of the year because Goddard was not healthy the entire year. He missed 7 games. And also, Jahan Dotson's not a very good player in general. So even when they had the three, it was mainly them. So Hurts was definitely hurt, pun unintended, with the production going to Barkley so much. But a lot of that was created by Hurts as well, by him opening up lanes for Barkley to rush, by making the defense, stay in to watch Hurts as opposed to, crashing in after Barkley. So Hurts definitely had some things that don't really go noticed by conventional stats, but overall, he wasn't the greatest in PFF grade in particular. That's the main thing that was like working against him in this measure. Next, we have Kyler Murray, who is very difficult to get a read on because, like Kirk Cousins, he was kind of a tale of two seasons. At the end of the season, he kind of fell apart, and the team did as well. So I'm not sure how much of that was him and how much was just, everything going wrong. But even still, he put together a really solid year, and he did it without passing deep, like at all, being 33rd in average depth of target. Murray was very efficient, though, with the success rate. And just overall, he was successful in a lot of the statistics that I highly value, being success rate, PFF grade, and QBR. So, he checked a lot of boxes there, but it's kind of funny. He was 15th in the other three stats, which I think is, you know, partly on him, but I think it's partly on the scheme as well, where he was running a lot, so he didn't get as many passing yards. They were handing it off to Connor. And then, passing wise, Trey McBride was sensational, but after him, it wasn't the most reliable of situations. Where Marvin Harrison Jr., very talented, but just could not get it going to start out his career. So, I think there was definitely some things that worked against him as well. But overall, a very solid year. Justin Herbert, I like how the difference in ideologies for the Chargers versus basically everybody else is revealed in Herbert's stats, where PFF was saying, yeah, he wasn't getting, receivers open a lot of the time, and he wasn't, being given a lot of opportunities, so he's not going to have the greatest per yards per game situations. But when he was tasked with passing, he was completing a lot of them and, making good decisions as well. He was passing deep with the 9th average depth of target. So he was getting, after deep balls, which is the most efficient way to play offense. And overall, he was efficient at basically every phase of the game, with Ladd McConkey being 9th in yards per route run and Quentin Johnston being 40th, which Quentin Johnston being in the top 200 is kind of a success in and of itself because he looked really rough. But, this year, Herbert got the best out of him, and Herbert overall just was making the best out of a situation that wasn't very good, aside from having a good offensive line, which, really strong at the tackles in particular, which is very helpful, of course, but not, everything. For Baker Mayfield, he really has a good across the board in his stats. The QBR, I'm not so sure why it's not very high because part of QBR's metric is based on EPA, and he's sixth in EPA. So being 14th in QBR is a bit odd to me, but he was really effective in, continually moving the chains and also getting, just accumulation of yards throughout the game as well. Mayfield, really solid year. I think this may have been his best year, especially when you factor in Mike Evans was seventh in yards per route run. Chris Godwin was 10th, but he only played 7 games. And then Cade Otton was 28th for tight ends in yards per route run. So, it was mainly Evans that was with Mayfield. For Brock Purdy, he had a very underrated year, I would say. I think a lot of people think he just, cost himself a lot of money with this season. Maybe he did, but he was very good. It wasn't, like he crapped the bed. And his worst stat being 11th. Granted, it's in one of the key stats in PFF. It's still, that's a really nice stat to have as your worst stat. Also being pretty good with deep ball throwing, even without Brandon Ayuk, and really only having Jawan Jennings and George Kittle for much of the year. He was really good. And the offensive line was good, but it wasn't great. So it wasn't like he was being carried by them either. Obviously, it was an above average situation, I would say, when you factor in above average offensive line, and then you have Kittle and Jennings. But, part of that production from Jennings being so good was just that Purdy was throwing to him a lot. And, he was putting balls in good places for Jennings. Next, we get to the one that will really get people mad in Patrick Mahomes, who had a good but not great year. Mahomes was, solid across the board, but that 27th in net yards per attempt is pretty rough. They had about as good of an offensive line as the Niners did. The Chiefs had the 13th best, and the Niners had the 12th best, according to PFF. So it wasn't like, it was just a offensive line thing. Yes, the tackles weren't good for much of the year, or really the left tackle in specific. Yes, Hopkins was the main receiving option. He was 48th in yards per out run, and Kelsey was 19th for tight ends in yards per out run. So I will concede that, the weapons around him failed him as well. But I think it makes sense he's not in the elite tier of quarterbacks, because this just was a year that was, good across the board, but not something that was like truly sensational. Something that was truly sensational, though, was Jaden Daniels' rookie year. We're at tier 1, by the way, if that wasn't clear. We are at the big dogs. And Daniels, he was incredibly enough fifth or top 5 in PFF grade and QBR, which is, my analytic darling right there. And, I'm willing to look past the yards per game because he had a lot of rushing yards. He was second in yards per game rushing for quarterbacks, and he was like a yard behind Lamar. So Daniels was really productive in that sense. And, he was doing it with basically just Terry McLaurin. I know Zach Ertz was something, but he was 28th in yards per out run for tight ends. The offensive line, 22nd. That's, one of the worst supporting cast for any of these like tier 2 or above quarterbacks. Daniels, he was the offense. It'll be interesting to see how he follows up the greatest rookie year of all time. And we move now to Jared Goff, who was stacking up number ones in EPA and success rate, and then second in yards per game and net yards per attempt. That is bonkers. The thing that really holds him back, though, is that PFF grade. He was 11th. I do think that's closer to where he was than number one. They were 18th in pass blocking, which I think surprised a lot of people. Credit to him, he did it with a 40th average depth of target. He was not just throwing deep every play, but it would have been nice to see that be an element for the team as well. We get now to the tier within the tier one, where it's just the absolute best, as Josh Allen is so good at everything except for passing yards per game, which again is kind of mitigated by, like with Daniels, it's mitigated with his rushing yards per game. So that is one thing that works in Allen's favor, even though it doesn't look good. And, just being top 6 in everything else that's meaningful, being 12th in average depth of target too, like that's fine. So, that's really good all around. He had the best offensive line out of any of the players in this tier, as he had the 5th best. The next closest was 7th best. Shakir, he was 21st in yards per route run. Dalton Kincaid, he was 10th for tight ends in yards per route run. There was, definitely some support in place, but overall, they were definitely more of a ground and pound team, which he enabled as well with his rushing abilities. And he was efficient in the times where he did pass as well. For number 2, the reveal of number 1, I think you can probably figure out then, is Joe Burrow. He was absolutely on one this year. The worst stat being that net yard per attempt, where he's 11th, but everything else is top 4. And I think a lot of that issue with the sack deduction is just straight up the offensive line sucked. They were 29th in pass blocking, so the worst in this tier. And Burrow has a great supporting receiving cast, with Jamar Chase being 7th in yards per out run, leading the league in like every other category though. T. Higgins being 28th, and then Mike Gesicki being 11th for tight ends in yards per out run. Yeah, that helps a lot. But Burrow was putting up some legendary numbers, being first in yards per game. That he was first by like 10 yards, I want to say, over the next person. So he was, pretty far and away number 1. Then just all across the board, like when your worst stat aside from that, or aside from net yards per attempt, is 4th, you're doing something right. And as you could probably figure out, number 1 is Lamar Jackson. And this was brutal. Like, the numbers being as close as they were made me feel bad for Burrow, and just Burrow not getting into the playoffs as well. Like, I wanted, him to do as well as he possibly could, which I guess, second is a really good landing spot. But Jackson, he was absolutely the man this year. He was number 1 in 2 of the most important stats in PFF and net yards per attempt. And then, being number 2 for QBR and EPA, plus completion percentage over expected. Again, like with Burrow, his worst stat was 11th, but he had so much rushing yards. He was first in the league in rushing yards for a quarterback. That I'll take 11th first of all, and any day of the week for yards per game. But then you factor in, yeah, he's the best rushing quarterback of the season. That's special stuff. Zay Flowers was 16th in yards per out run. Mark Andrews was 6th for tight ends in yards per out run, and Isaiah Likely was 14th in that stat as well. So that's, a really good supporting cast, but he didn't have the Jamar Chase or, the offensive line that some of the other elite quarterbacks had, like with, Baker Mayfield, he had the second best, or Jordan Love, he had the third best. He had the seventh best. 7 is definitely very good, but I think there's quite a difference between being seventh and third, say. So Lamar was making everybody look so much better. And also, of course, Derrick Henry, I didn't even mention. But, you know, Lamar was making everybody's job easier because everybody had to pay attention to Lamar possibly keeping the ball on runs, and they had to contain Rush instead of rush Lamar in a conventional way. So there was, just a lot of things Lamar did beyond the stats that were favorable for the team. And I think it makes sense that he was number one overall. I think, PFF hit the nail on the head with him being number one, because I do think watching him play, you just see something special basically every play. Those are my thoughts on the quarterbacks of the 2024-2025 season. Be sure to let me know what yours are in the comments section. And also be sure to like and subscribe for more NFL content.